Welcome to Sports Live Media on YouTube. It's you guys, Sports Live, broadcasting live today, July 21st, 2025. We're going to do the Major League Baseball games, my perspective, and the games we're going to look at are for Monday, July 21st, 2025, and we'll go each day, the 22nd, 23rd, 25th, 26th, and 27th. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over who is playing on each day, the starting pitcher, and any other pertinent information that might be relevant. And then what I'll do is I'll go through and tell you who I picked to win the games for those said days. So let's get started. Can y'all hear me out there in YouTube land? All right. Let's see. So for Monday, July 21st, you have Cleveland versus Baltimore, 5:40 p.m. Central Time. It'll be Tomoyuki Sugano versus Tanner Bilby. You have Detroit versus Pittsburgh, 5:40 p.m. Jack Flattery versus Paul Skinnis. You have San Diego versus Miami, 5:40 p.m., which will be Undecided versus Yuri Perez. You have Boston versus Philadelphia, 5:45 p.m., which will be Walker Buehler versus Zach Wheeler. You have Cincinnati versus Washington, 5:45 p.m., Brady Singer versus Jake Irvin. And hang on just a minute. Can't hear due to the train coming. Okay, next up you have the New York Yankees versus Toronto. That'll be at 6:07 p.m. You'll have Carlos Rodon versus Kevin Gausman. You have Los Angeles Angels versus the New York Mets, 6:10 p.m. Tyler Anderson versus Kodai Senga. You have San Francisco versus Atlanta, 6:15 p.m., which will be Hayden Birdsong versus Bryce Elder. You have the Chicago White Sox versus Tampa Bay. 6:35 p.m. with Sean Burke versus Shane Baz. You have Kansas City versus the Chicago Cubs, 7:05 p.m. Noah Cameron versus Undecided. You have the Athletics versus Texas at 7:05 p.m., which will be Jacob Lopez versus Jack Leader. You have St. Louis versus Colorado, which will be Michael McGreevy versus Austin Gomber. You have Houston versus Atlanta at 8:40 p.m. Colton Gordon versus Zach Gallen. You have Milwaukee versus Seattle at 8:40 p.m. Brandon Woodruff versus George Kirby. David Festa versus Shohei Ohtani in the game Minnesota versus the Los Angeles Dodgers. That's at 9:10 p.m. And hello, me and my snake. We're going over who's playing in Major League Baseball for the games that are being played today through Sunday. And what I'm doing is I'm going over each game that's being played, the starting pitcher, and any other pertinent information. And then as soon as I get through with that, then I'm going to go through and make my picks for who I think will win the Major League Baseball games. That's what's going on. Thank you for joining me today, me and my snake. I do appreciate that. Anyway, so for the games on Monday, July 21st, we just went over who's playing. Now I'm going to make my picks for who I think will win the games. In the game, Cleveland versus Baltimore, I have Cleveland winning. Detroit versus Pittsburgh, I have Detroit. Miami versus San Diego, I have Miami. Boston versus Philadelphia, I have Boston. Washington, I have them beating Cincinnati. The New York Yankees will defeat Toronto. The New York Mets will defeat the Los Angeles Angels. San Francisco will beat Atlanta. Tampa Bay will defeat Chicago White Sox. Kansas City will defeat the Chicago Cubs. Texas defeats the Athletics. St. Louis will defeat Colorado. Arizona will defeat Houston. Milwaukee will defeat Seattle. And Los Angeles Dodgers will defeat Minnesota. So, next we have the games for July 22nd. Before I go further, I do not have the information on the over-under, and I do not have the information for the money line on any of these games, so that information will not be included. The only time I include that is if I actually have that info. So for July 22nd, we have Baltimore versus Cleveland, 5:40 p.m. Central. Brandon Young versus Joey Cantillo. You have Pittsburgh versus Detroit, 5:40 p.m. Central. Casey Mize versus Mitch Keller. All times I mentioned will be at Central Time, so that way I don't have to keep saying Central. Just know that all the times I list will be Central Time. You have San Diego versus Miami, 5:40 p.m. will be Undecided versus Edward Cabrera. Boston versus Philadelphia. We have Philadelphia playing Boston, which will be Richard Pitts versus Christopher Sanchez. Ohio State's a good football team, and we will be doing football live streams, but that's not until we'll start that back up in August. So, anyway, moving on. Cincinnati versus Washington. Toronto versus the New York Yankees. Los Angeles Angels versus the New York Mets. Atlanta versus San Francisco. Chicago versus Tampa Bay. Or Chicago White Sox versus Tampa Bay. You have the Chicago Cubs versus Kansas City. You have the Athletics versus Texas. You have Colorado versus St. Louis. You have Houston versus Arizona. Let's see, who else we got? You also have Seattle versus Milwaukee, and then Minnesota versus the Los Angeles Dodgers. So, my picks for Tuesday's games on July 22nd, I have Baltimore defeating Cleveland, Pittsburgh defeating Detroit, San Diego defeating Miami, Philadelphia defeating Boston, Cincinnati defeats Washington, Toronto defeats the New York Yankees, the Los Angeles Angels defeats the New York Mets, Atlanta defeats San Francisco, Chicago defeats Tampa Bay, or Chicago White Sox defeats Tampa Bay, Chicago Cubs defeats Kansas City, the Athletics defeats Texas, St. Louis loses to Colorado, Arizona loses to Houston, Seattle will defeat Milwaukee, and Minnesota will defeat the Los Angeles Angels. Next, we have are the games for Wednesday, July 23rd. And in those games, we have the following. Cincinnati versus Washington, 11:05 a.m. Nick Lodolo versus Michael Soroka. San Diego versus Miami, 11:10 a.m. Dylan Cease versus Sandy Alcantara. San Francisco versus Atlanta, 11:15 a.m. Justin Verlander versus Spencer Strider. You have Detroit versus Pittsburgh, which will be Reese Olson versus Bailey Falter. You have the Los Angeles Angels versus the New York Mets, which will be 12:10 p.m. Undecided versus Sean Manaea. You have the Chicago Cubs versus Kansas City, 1:20 p.m. Seth Lugo versus Colin Ray. You have St. Louis versus Colorado at 2:10 p.m. Andre Paliante versus Kyle Freeland. Houston versus Arizona, 2:40 p.m. Brandon Walter versus Brandon Pafat. Milwaukee versus Seattle, which will be 2:40 p.m. Quinn Priester versus Luis Castillo. You have Minnesota versus the Los Angeles Dodgers, which will be 3:10 p.m. Chris Paddock versus Tyler Glasnow, or however that's pronounced. You have Baltimore versus Cleveland, 5:40 p.m. Charlie Morton versus Slade Ciccone, or Ciccone. Boston versus Philadelphia, Lucas Giolito versus Jesus Luzardo. The New York Yankees versus Toronto, 6:07 p.m. Max Fried versus Chris Bassett. Tampa Bay versus Chicago, 6:35 p.m. And the Chicago White Sox is who the Chicago team is. It'll be Jonathan Cannon versus Taj Bradley. Then you have the Athletics versus Texas, 7:05 p.m. J.P. Sears versus Patrick Corbin. So for the games on July 23rd, thank you. You're very welcome, me and my snake. I do greatly appreciate it very much. For the games on Wednesday, July 23rd, here are my picks for who I think will win the game. I have Cincinnati defeating Washington. San Diego defeats Miami. San Francisco defeats Atlanta. Detroit will defeat Pittsburgh. The Los Angeles Dodgers will defeat the New York Mets. Chicago Cubs will defeat Kansas City. Colorado will defeat St. Louis. Arizona defeats Houston. Milwaukee loses to Seattle. The Los Angeles Dodgers defeats Minnesota. Baltimore defeats Cleveland. Boston defeats Philadelphia. Toronto defeats the New York Yankees. Chicago White Sox loses to Tampa Bay, and you have the Athletics that will defeat Texas. So, moving on to the games for July 24th, that's just Thursday. Not many games on Thursday, but you have Baltimore versus Cleveland, 12:10 p.m. Dean Kremer versus Logan Allen. You have Toronto versus Detroit, Eric Lauer versus Undecided. San Diego versus St. Louis, 6:45 p.m. Yu Darvish versus Sonny Gray. The Athletics versus Houston, 7:10 p.m. Luis Severino versus Lance McCullers Jr. And then the Los Angeles Angels versus Seattle, 8:38 p.m. Logan Evans versus Yusei Kikuchi. And in the games on July 24th, I have Baltimore defeating Cleveland, Toronto defeats Detroit, St. Louis defeats San Diego, the Athletics will defeat Houston, the Los Angeles Angels will defeat Seattle. Moving on to July 25th, on Friday, you have Miami versus Milwaukee, 3:10 p.m. Cal Quantrill versus Freddie Peralta. Arizona versus Pittsburgh, 5:40 p.m. Ryan Nelson versus Mike Burrows. Colorado versus Baltimore, 6:05 p.m. Antonio Senzatella versus Trevor Rogers. Philadelphia versus the New York Yankees, 6:05 p.m. Tajuan Walker versus Will Warren. Los Angeles Dodgers versus Boston, 6:10 p.m. Emmett Sheehan versus Brayan Bello. Tampa Bay versus Cincinnati, 6:10 p.m. Zach Littell versus Nick Martinez. Toronto versus Detroit, 6:10 p.m. Jose Barrios versus Tariq Skubal. San Diego versus St. Louis, 6:15 p.m. Nick Pivetta versus Miles Mikolas. Chicago Cubs versus the Chicago White Sox, 6:40 p.m. Shota Imanaga versus Adrian Hauser. Atlanta versus Texas, 7:05 p.m. Joey Wentz versus Kumar Rocker. Cleveland versus Kansas City, 7:10 p.m. Gavin Williams versus Michael Waka. The Athletics versus Houston, 7:10 p.m. Jeffrey Springs versus Undecided. Washington versus Minnesota. Mitchell Parker versus Undecided. Seattle versus the Los Angeles Angels, 8:38 p.m. Undecided versus Jose Soriano. New York Mets versus San Francisco, 9:15 p.m. Clay Holmes versus Undecided. So, for the games on July 25th, I have Miami defeating Milwaukee, Arizona defeats Pittsburgh, Colorado defeats Baltimore, the New York Yankees loses to Philadelphia, Los Angeles Dodgers defeats Boston, Tampa Bay defeats Cincinnati, Detroit loses to Toronto, San Diego defeats St. Louis, Chicago Cubs defeats the Chicago White Sox, Atlanta defeats Texas, Cleveland defeats Kansas City, the Athletics defeat Houston, Washington defeats Minnesota, Seattle defeats the Los Angeles Angels, the New York Mets defeats San Francisco. Now we have the games for July 26, which is Saturday. In those games, you have Philadelphia versus New York, 12:05 p.m. Rangers Suarez versus Marcus Stroman. Toronto versus Detroit, 5:10 p.m. Kevin Gausman versus Jack Flaherty. Arizona versus Pittsburgh, 5:40 p.m. Merritt Kelly versus Andrew Haney. Tampa Bay versus Cincinnati, 5:40 p.m. Ryan Pepiot versus Andrew Abbott. Colorado versus Baltimore, 6:05 p.m. Herman Marquez or German Marquez versus Tomoyuki Sugano. Atlanta versus Texas, 6:05 p.m. Grant Holmes versus Undecided. Chicago Cubs versus Chicago White Sox. Undecided versus Aaron Saval. Miami versus Milwaukee. Jason Junk versus Jose Quintana. The Athletics will play Houston, 6:10 p.m. Do not have the information for the pitching matchup for the starting pitchers on that game. Washington versus Minnesota, 6:10 p.m. Mackenzie Gore versus Joe Ryan. Los Angeles Dodgers versus Boston, 6:15 p.m. Clayton Kershaw versus Garrett Crochet. Let's see. We have Cleveland versus Kansas City, 6:15 p.m. Tanner Bilby versus Chris Bubik. San Diego versus St. Louis, 6:15 p.m. I do not have the information for the starting pitchers in that game. Let's see, you have the New York Mets versus San Francisco, 8:05 p.m. David Peterson versus undecided. And you have Seattle versus Los Angeles, which will be 8:38 p.m. and that'll be undecided versus Tyler Anderson. So in the games for Saturday, let's see, I have Los Angeles defeating Seattle, San Francisco defeats the New York Mets, St. Louis defeats San Diego, Kansas City will defeat Cleveland, the New York Yankees will defeat Philadelphia, Detroit defeats Toronto, Pittsburgh defeats Arizona, Cincinnati will defeat Tampa Bay, Baltimore defeats Colorado, Texas will defeat Atlanta, Chicago White Sox will defeat the Chicago Cubs, Milwaukee defeats Miami, Houston will defeat the Athletics, Washington loses to Minnesota, Boston will beat the Los Angeles Dodgers. So next we have in line is the games finally for Sunday, July 27th. You have Arizona versus Pittsburgh, 12:35 p.m., which will be Zach Gallen versus Paul Skinnis. You have Colorado versus Baltimore, 12:35 p.m., Austin Gomber versus Brandon Young. The Los Angeles Dodgers, you have versus Boston, and that'll be Shohei Ohtani versus undecided. You have Philadelphia versus the New York Yankees, which will be Zach Wheeler versus Cam Shitler, or something like that. Tampa Bay versus Cincinnati, 12:40 p.m. Shane Baz versus Brady Singer. You have Toronto versus Detroit, 12:40 p.m. Max Scherzer versus Casey Mize. You have Chicago Cubs versus the Chicago White Sox, 1:10 p.m. No information is available on the starting pitchers for that game. You have Cleveland versus Kansas City, which will be Joey Cantillo versus undecided. You have Miami versus Milwaukee, 1:10 p.m. Yuri Perez versus Brandon Woodruff. You have the Athletics versus Houston, 1:10 p.m. No information is available on the starting pitchers for that game. Washington versus Minnesota, 1:10 p.m. Jake Irvin versus David Festa. You have San Diego versus St. Louis at 1:15 p.m. No information is available on the starting pitchers for that game. You have Atlanta versus Texas, 1:35 p.m. Bryce Elder versus Jack Letter. You have Seattle versus Los Angeles Angels, which will be 3:07 p.m., which will be undecided versus Kyle Hendricks. And you have the New York Mets versus San Francisco, 6:10 p.m. Kodai Senga versus undecided. So in the games on July 27th, I have Arizona defeating Pittsburgh, Colorado defeats Baltimore, the Los Angeles Dodgers defeats Boston, Philadelphia defeats New York Yankees, Cincinnati loses to Tampa Bay, Detroit defeats Toronto, Chicago White Sox defeats the Chicago Cubs, Kansas City defeats Cleveland, Milwaukee defeats Miami, Houston defeats the Athletics, Washington defeats Minnesota, San Diego defeats St. Louis, Texas defeats Atlanta, the Los Angeles Angels defeats Seattle, New York Mets loses to San Francisco. So, just a quick review. Who do I have winning the games this week? July 21st, Cleveland defeats Baltimore, Detroit defeats Cleveland, Miami defeats San Diego, Boston defeats Philadelphia, Washington defeats Cincinnati, New York Yankees defeats Toronto, the New York Mets defeats the Los Angeles Angels, San Francisco defeats Atlanta, Tampa Bay defeats the Chicago White Sox, Kansas City defeats the Chicago Cubs, Texas defeats the Athletics, St. Louis defeats Colorado, Arizona defeats Houston, Milwaukee defeats Seattle, Los Angeles defeats Minnesota. My picks for who will win on July 22nd. Baltimore defeats Cleveland, Pittsburgh defeats Detroit, San Diego defeats Miami, Philadelphia defeats Boston, Cincinnati defeats Washington, Toronto defeats the New York Yankees, the Los Angeles Angels defeats the New York Mets, Atlanta defeats San Francisco, Chicago White Sox defeats Tampa Bay, the Chicago Cubs defeats Kansas City, Athletics defeat Texas, Colorado defeats St. Louis, Houston defeats Arizona. Let's see, you have Seattle defeating Milwaukee, Minnesota defeats the Los Angeles Los Angeles Dodgers, I'm sorry. Next, we have we have the games for July 23rd. Cincinnati defeats Washington. San Diego will defeat Miami. San Francisco will defeat Atlanta. Detroit will defeat Pittsburgh. The Los Angeles Angels will defeat the New York Mets. Chicago Cubs wins over Kansas City. Colorado defeats St. Louis. Houston loses to Arizona. Milwaukee loses to Seattle. Los Angeles Dodgers defeats Minnesota. Baltimore defeats Cleveland. Boston defeats Philadelphia. Toronto will defeat the New York Yankees. Tampa Bay defeats Chicago White Sox. Athletics defeats Texas. All right, so for the games on Thursday, July 24th, let's see, you have Baltimore defeats Cleveland. Toronto will defeat Detroit. St. Louis defeats San Diego. The Athletics defeat Houston. Los Angeles will defeat Seattle. For the games on July 25th, you have Miami will defeat Milwaukee. Arizona defeats Pittsburgh. Colorado defeats Baltimore. I have Philadelphia defeating the New York Yankees. The Los Angeles Dodgers beating Boston. Tampa Bay defeats Cincinnati. Toronto defeats Detroit. San Diego defeats St. Louis. The Chicago Cubs defeats the Chicago White Sox. Atlanta defeats Texas. Cleveland defeats Kansas City. The Athletics defeats Houston. Washington defeats Minnesota. Seattle defeats Los Angeles. The New York Mets will defeat San Francisco. For Saturday, July 26th, the games I have winning on that. Thank you very much for telling me that, Golden Jacket. I do appreciate it. For July 25th, let me see. Wait a minute. Yeah, for July 25th, I have Miami defeats Milwaukee. Arizona defeats Pittsburgh. Colorado defeats Baltimore. Philadelphia defeats the New York Yankees. The Los Angeles Dodgers defeats Boston. Tampa Bay defeats Cincinnati. Toronto defeats Detroit. San Diego defeats St. Louis. Chicago Cubs will defeat the Chicago White Sox. Atlanta defeats Texas. Cleveland will defeat Kansas City. Athletics will defeat Houston. Washington will defeat Minnesota. Seattle will defeat Los Angeles. New York Mets will defeat San Francisco. For the games July 26th on Saturday, I have the New York Yankees defeating Philadelphia. Detroit defeats Toronto. Pittsburgh defeats Arizona. Cincinnati defeats Tampa Bay. Baltimore defeats Colorado. Texas defeats Atlanta. The Chicago White Sox defeats the Chicago Cubs. Milwaukee defeats Miami. Houston defeats Athletics. Minnesota will defeat Washington. Boston will defeat the Los Angeles Dodgers. Let's see. Kansas City defeats Cleveland. St. Louis defeats San Diego. San Francisco will defeat the New York Mets. The Los Angeles Angels will defeat Seattle. And finally, for the games on July 27th, I have Arizona defeating Pittsburgh. Colorado defeats Baltimore. The Los Angeles Dodgers defeats Boston. Philadelphia defeats the New York Yankees. Tampa Bay defeats Cincinnati. Detroit wins over Toronto. Chicago Cubs loses to the Chicago White Sox. Kansas City defeats Cleveland. Milwaukee defeats Miami. Houston will defeat the Athletics. Washington defeats Minnesota. San Diego defeats St. Louis. Texas will defeat Arizona. Seattle loses to the Los Angeles Angels, and the New York Mets will lose to the San Francisco team. So anyway, that is my picks for all Major League Baseball games for today, July 21st, and going through all games on July 27th, which is going to be Sunday. So thank you for taking the time to hear the Major League Baseball games, my perspective for the games July 21st through 27th of 2025. If you will, please hit the like button, please hit the subscribe button, please hit the notification bell so you can be made aware when I'm broadcasting live, when I have sports action videos, when I have sports education videos, again, when I broadcast live, and when I have breaking news in the sports world. If you wish to subscribe to the channel, it is greatly appreciated, and I do appreciate each and every one of you who have done so. But there are two ways to do it. One, you go to www.youtube.com, the slash symbol, the at symbol, SPORTSLOV, or you can go to the YouTube search tab and type in Bob Amin. You'll know it's me because I have Sports Love Media burned into a basketball as my avatar. I'm also on Twitter X. My handle there is at Bob Amin 16. That's the at symbol, BOBAMIN 16. Thank you again for tuning in today for the live stream. Just some quick announcements. We will be starting college football weekly live stream where basically I look at the Associated Press poll top 25. We look at the matchups within the top 25, and then we look at what Vegas has to say regarding the point spread or the margin of victory that the teams will have, as well as the over-under in those games. And then if I agree or disagree with the pros, I will explain myself as logically as I can with that. We will be starting those live streams for that around the middle of August, depending on when I get the first poll for the preseason. There will be other live streams that will be coming up. We will continue to do Major League Baseball live streams. We will have go-kart racing where I will be broadcasting live on location, covering those go-kart events. And I will announce when those live streams will come about. So again, thank you for tuning in today. Do any of you have any questions, comments, concerns? If so, you can put them in the chat. Well, if not, thank you again for tuning in to this live stream today. I'm Bob Amin with Sports Love Media, signing out. Thank you and have a wonderful day.